1973. As Pink Floyd showed the world the way to the dark side of the moon, Gladys Knight was boarding her midnight train to Georgia. Billie Jean King emerged triumphant in the Battle of the Sexes, and The Exorcist terrified cinema-goers around the world. In the UK, Sunderland of all clubs were victorious in the FA Cup final. So far so good for all involved, but something else happened that year. A decision by a small group of leaders from a handful of key oil-producing countries to impose an oil embargo on the allies of Israel in the wake of the Yom Kippur War would shock economies and trigger a global recession. This is the story of the 1973 oil crisis. To understand the roots of the crisis, we have to look at the structure of big oil in the decades preceding 1973. Since the Second World War, oil sources across the Middle East, Africa and South America had been controlled by Western companies. The Seven Sisters, as these companies were known, had colluded with each other since the 1940s on prices, rates of production and exportation. The balance, or rather the imbalance of power between oil-producing countries and the Western companies that controlled them, was a growing source of friction. In 1960, OPEC was formed, a cartel to represent the interests of oil-producing nations with a view to wresting back some degree of autonomy. Much of the organisation's focus in the late 60s was on trying to convince big oil to raise prices and to distribute the proceeds more generously to oil producers. On the 6th of October 1973, a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish festival of Yom Kippur. The invasion must be understood as a follow-on from the Six-Day War of 1967, in which Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, territories that Egypt and Syria now sought to reclaim. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir had been aware some days previously that Syrian forces were gathering near to Golan, but on the advice of her staff opted not to strike preemptively, something she would later be blamed for by her domestic critics. The Egyptian and Syrian forces successfully pushed through into the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights respectively, and Israel looked to its Western allies to restock its dwindling munitions supply. Though initially reluctant, the US increased its supplies to Israel on realising that the Soviet Union was upping its support for Egypt and Syria. It's worth pointing out here though that this latter point is complex, as throughout the early years of his tenure, President Sadat of Egypt had sought to distance his government from Soviet interference. The increased support from the US to Israel further antagonised the Arab members of OPEC, including King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who had previously enjoyed cordial relations with the US. 11 days after the start of the conflict, a splinter group of OPEC members agreed to simultaneously raise their benchmark oil price by 70% and reduce production. Crude oil exports to countries that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War were stopped completely, in a move that primarily impacted the United States, the UK, Canada, the Netherlands and Japan. In the days and weeks that followed, oil prices first doubled and then almost quadrupled to over $12 a barrel. The ensuing energy crisis marked the end of the era of cheap petrol. The share value of the New York Stock Exchange dropped by $97 billion, ushering in one of the worst recessions the world had ever seen. The move triggered a diplomatic crisis, with Western leaders scrambling to overturn it. US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger grew increasingly frustrated as his attempts to negotiate an about-turn were ignored. Kissinger also revealed some of his personal bias when he said in a memo to the US Secretary of Defense, "It is ridiculous that the civilized world is being held up by 8 million savages." Anxieties grew in Britain and across Europe that Kissinger and Nixon were steering the US toward military intervention with a view to ending the embargo by force. Though fortunately this didn't happen, it showed that a shift was happening in US diplomacy, and an increased openness to using military might for oil control was on the horizon. Away from big politics, ordinary people felt the sharp end of the embargo. In Britain, drivers sat in endless queues hoping for a few gallons of petrol, and speed limits on public roads were cut to conserve fuel. TV adverts encouraged people to turn down their central heating and wear jumpers, and at the peak of the crisis, a strike by Britain's coal miners exacerbated the shortage, and the Heath government introduced a 3-day working week to save electricity. In America, "Don't be fuelish" became a slogan. Gas-guzzling American engines suddenly didn't seem so appealing. and whilst Japan struggled in the short term in the wake of the crisis, in the long term this opened up a whole new market to smaller, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars. The oil shock triggered a chain reaction, inflation soared, unemployment rose, economic growth stalled. For the first time in decades, the West experienced stagflation, a term coined by economist Paul Samuelson for a nasty mix of stagnant growth and rising prices. Perhaps more significantly, the crisis highlighted the extent to which Western countries were dependent on imported oil. During the decades that American and European companies had controlled foreign oil fields, this hadn't really mattered. But as the age of the Seven Sisters waned, Western governments were forced to reckon with their own slackening grip on the reins of global power. Nixon had already been thinking along these lines prior to the shock, and in the April of '73 had announced a new energy strategy with the aim of boosting domestic production. In Europe, some countries were already stockpiling oil, albeit not enough to mitigate the crisis, but which did slightly cushion the blow comparative to America. After the sharp increase in oil prices, domestic production seemed more viable in Britain, and operations were expanded in the North Sea throughout the 1970s, albeit at a high cost. Sweden, also heavily impacted by the embargo, took a different route and committed to reducing its dependency on oil altogether, seeking alternative fuel sources. Meanwhile, the wealth of oil-rich nations grew at an accelerated pace. The Gulf states, flush with petrodollars, began investing in infrastructure, real estate and Western banks. Cities like Dubai and Riyadh started their transformation into global powerhouses, spurred on by the union of the Emirates as the United Arab Emirates in 1972 and the introduction of the shared currency, the UAE dirham, in 1973. This growth became more complex as the decade went on, as fluctuating prices and currency conversions had an impact, but fundamentally these countries experienced a short-term boost to revenues, to say the very least. The crisis also had an enormous impact on economic thinking. The ensuing period of high unemployment and high inflation in the wake of the crisis undermined people's faith in both the reliability of the Phillips curve and in Keynesian economics as a means to solve fiscal problems. Implementing the ideas of John Maynard Keynes had been fruitful in the West in the post-war period, but as unprecedented rises in inflation and unemployment happened simultaneously, they opened the door for new ways of thinking as these methods seemed not to be working. The turn away from Keynes paved the way for the embrace of monetarist ideas and ultimately to the seismic economic changes across the West in the 1980s. In Britain, it's perfectly possible that without the oil crisis in '73, there is no Thatcher in '79. Ultimately, the global impact of the crisis is much too complex to cover in a few minutes, but the key takeaways are clear. In '73, the embargo instigated an economic crisis that would change the world. It shifted the balance of global power and laid the foundations for a new economic order. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. As ever, thank you for watching.